Hi, this is the 5th episode of Matinees on Main Street, a podcast about the history of the movies. My name is Alan, and today's story takes place in the last few years of the 1870s. It happens on a massive horse farm that exists where Stanford University currently sits. It's the second time that the former California governor, Leland Stanford, and photographer Eadweard Muybrdige got together to take photographs of running horses. The results from these photographic sessions will put in motion the men who will create the moving pictures. But first, we have to go back in time to Sacramento, where Muybrdige took the first series of photographs of horses for the former governor. To do this, it'll be a good idea to remind ourselves of what happened back in episode 3. We'll start with Muybrdige. He was an Englishman who traveled to America as a young man. He had a few marketable skills, primarily the ability to sell published books and artwork. He spent a decade in America, the 10 years before the Civil War to be exact, and he lived in San Francisco for 5 of those years. On his way back to England, he experienced a tragic stagecoach accident in Texas that left him comatose and with poor vision for quite some time. He spent the Civil War years in Europe and discovered a love of photography. When he returned to California, he became one of the West's top landscape photographers, and it was through his celebrity that he came to know Leland Stanford. Stanford had trained as a lawyer in New York. After a failed law practice, he took off for California, where his brothers had started a merchandise business. Based in Sacramento, Stanford ran the store while some of his brothers were drawn into the gold field. He was a friendly man who was also rather secretive and taciturn. He joined 3 other men in forming the Central Pacific Railroad, a company that was attempting to link the West Coast with Eastern railroads. In 1861, Stanford was elected governor of California and held the office for 2 years. The linking of the Central Pacific with the Union Pacific became a national project, and by the end of the 1860s, the railroad was complete and the 4 men were wealthy. Stanford started to collect trotter racehorses and hired Muybrdige to photograph his soon-to-be famous racehorse, Occident. Lithographic prints were made of the photo, which Stanford sent to his friends and journalists. So, what immediately happened to the 2 men, and why did they decide to create a sequel to the Occident pictures? Well, Stanford's life immediately after the Sacramento photos presents a fairly clear picture. The ex-governor and his 3 partners found themselves among the wealthiest people in America, if not the absolute wealthiest. Besides building a railroad, the company also started buying up their competition or forcing them out of business. By the early 1870s, the Central Pacific was just about the only way to travel throughout the West Coast. It was also one of the more expensive. Once a person got to California, he or she discovered that all of the railroad routes were owned by the Big Four, and the rates were high. Farmers were charged a lot to transport goods, as were merchants in order to bring in product from the East. Maybe Stanford, Huntington, Crocker, and Hopkins were not the crooks that the East Coast partners were, but they certainly were transportation sharks. It had once looked as if they were the saviors of the West Coast, willing to sacrifice their money to bring a national railroad to the Pacific. By the early 1870s, they were looked upon as vultures, stealing California's money. Not long after Muybrdige took the picture of Occident, the 4 men of the Central Pacific started moving to San Francisco. This may have been due to the attitudes of the Sacramentans towards the greedy success of the Big Four. Resentment was starting to run deep towards the West Coast Railroad monopoly. In San Francisco, these gentlemen could keep an eye on their shipping, build mansions that were even bigger than the houses they owned in Sacramento, and mingle with the wealthy knobs of the Bay Area. Stanford had a massive new house designed to his wife's specifications. This 50,000 square foot masterpiece of Victorian architecture was built in the most glamorous location in the city, a large hill with a great view of the San Francisco Bay, and soon to be known as Nob Hill. As for the ex-governor himself, he made plans for a new horse farm. While his wife and he waited for the house to be built, Leland Stanford became interested in a very large property south of San Francisco known as Mayfield Grange. He was tipped off to the farm by real estate developer George Gordon. Stanford was soon buying up nearby farms until he was satisfied with his 7,000 acres. He and his wife renamed the place Palo Alto after a few tall sequoias on the property. 8 racetracks were built for training his horses, as were a number of large stables, housing for his 36 workers on the horse farm, and a rail line coming out of San Francisco, courtesy of the Central Pacific. Stanford had a gloriously provisioned horse car built for the occasion, and soon started transporting his horses from Union Park in Sacramento to Palo Alto. Around this time, he had probably come across Etienne Jules Murray's research on animal movement. Muybridige's story of those years is very different. When Muybrdige had returned to San Francisco in 1865, he sold his first commercial photographs through a friend's small gallery, but after a few years, he started to sell them through the most important art gallery in the area, the Nall Brothers. At some point between his gallery move and his photographic project with Stanford and Occident, Muybrdige established a relationship with the Nall Brothers' photo retoucher, a young lady named Flora Downs Stone. Flora was living in the neighborhood and seemed to have been trained as a retoucher as a way to support herself. She was around 18 years old. As Flora Downs, she was from out east and had lived with a struggling family that eventually abandoned her to an aunt. When the aunt's family headed west, Flora went with them. Before her work at Nall's, she had been married for a year and a half before leaving her husband, Lucius Stone. Flora said her marriage had been rather abusive, primarily due to her mother-in-law. The Stones had a very successful saddlery business, and Lucius seems to have been the future heir of the family fortune. Flora said that her mother-in-law believed that Flora was a gold digger, and eventually she separated from the Stones. While it's not known how Muybrdige and Flora's relationship developed or how each felt about the other, at some point Flora did take off with Muybrdige on one of his photographic expeditions into California's interior. Muybrdige had a nice apartment in San Francisco, but much of his time was spent traveling throughout the West Coast, taking the pictures that the Nalls would sell. He traveled as far as the Pacific Northwest, Canada, and even Alaska. In 1871, Muybrdige seems to have convinced Flora to divorce her husband. She divorced Lucius on the grounds of cruelty, which could be quite a large legal umbrella in those days. She also stated that there was too great a difference in the years between she and her husband. As she was 16 at the time, marrying a man who was 8 years older could seem both impressive and overwhelming. What is more puzzling is that Flora then married Eadweard Muybrdige, a man who was 20 years older than her. We could find quite a number of psychological issues involved in these choices, although no one really knows if any of them are right. What is true is that Muybrdige continued to travel the West Coast on fairly long photographic journeys, and Flora was not really interested in traveling with him, as she'd have to deal with things such as rough sleeping arrangements, wild animals, camp food, the weather, the dust, and hardships. Muybrdige, like many men, also seemed to be rather indifferent to her emotional needs, except when he could use money to pacify his wife. He really did love her, but it's doubtful that he knew her at all. It does seem that Muybridige's regular disappearances into the wild left her alone, empty, and rather friendless. No one knows at this point. What is known is that after some time she took up with an itinerant reporter named Harry Larkins. Larkins seems to have been one of those cordial gadabouts who enjoys the pleasure of other people's company, but could never hold a decent job. He occasionally wrote for local newspapers, but also spent considerable time in the saloons. He seems to have been enchanted by Flora, or at least willing to woo her into some kind of relationship. As Muybrdige continued on his long photographic odysseys, Flora and Harry fell deeply in love and into trouble. When Muybrdige was out photographing the wonders of the West, Larkins would take Flora out for a good time. Eventually, Muybrdige got wind of this, and Flora defended Larkins by saying he was just a friend. Even if he was a friend, Muybrdige couldn't let this arrangement go, and he threatened Larkins, telling him that it wasn't proper for a young lady to be out at night. He said that if Larkins continued to defy the Muybrdige marriage, he, Muybrdige, had the right to do what was proper to protect his marriage and his wife's reputation. Larkins had been warned. Eventually, Flora got pregnant by either Muybrdige or Larkins. As her pregnancy advanced, both men grew excited and believed that the child was theirs. Flora believed it was Harry's. When the baby boy was born, he was named Florado, probably after his mother. Muybrdige was delightedly happy, but he soon discovered that Flora and Larkins had nicknamed the child Little Harry, because they both thought he looked like Larkins. Soon after, the nurse confessed to Muybrdige about the continuing romance between Flora and Larkins. Harry had continued to take her out after Muybrdige had threatened him, and he attended to Flora when the baby was born. He visited her regularly, 3 times a week, with the bedroom door closed, and apparently they were thinking of marrying one day. It seems that more than money, Flora was craving attention, and she was getting it from Harry Larkins. Larkins was barely employed, but he had convinced her of his true love, which was possible, if not financially supportable, and Flora was deeply in love with him. Muybrdige flew into a rage when he heard the story. Taking his gun and a wagon, he tracked Larkins down to the small town of Napa. Finding him in a bar, Muybrdige supposedly said that he had the answer to the letter that Larkins had written his wife. Larkins pleaded for his life and swore that he would never see Flora again. Muybrdige shot him fatally and left to find the sheriff. Larkins died, and Muybrdige was arrested. Muybrdige had murdered Harry Larkins about 5 years before he photographed his famous horse-running sequence at Palo Alto. In California, Muybrdige had been a bit of an artistic celebrity. The murder and trial made him notorious. The trial's verdict, on the other hand, made him famous. Muybridige's lawyer and his partner turned out to be friends of Stanford's. The connection between the lawyers and Stanford stirs a lot of curiosity concerning the relations between the railroad tycoon and the photographer. There is no physical evidence that Stanford hired the lawyers, but the coincidence leads to a number of questions. Concerning the coming Palo Alto photographic sessions, one question is whether the two men had made arrangements before the murder to continue working together. This is an important question because the photographic project at Palo Alto is so incredibly important to the history of the movies. To some people, the two men left to follow their own lives after photographing Occident, and that the two reunited a few years after the trial. Others believe that the lawyer's friendship with Stanford reveals a connection between Stanford and Muybrdige, and an agreement to reunite already existed between them. There is also the matter of the Central American project that followed the trial. Those who believe in the Stanford connection also believe that the Central American trip had already been scheduled, that Stanford was freeing Muybrdige to work on the project. Without good proof, both arguments are more speculation than fact, but each point of view in its own way defines the way we view the relationship between Stanford and Muybrige. They also give us two ways to see the relationship that existed between the two photographic sessions. It's pretty obvious that with a second series of horse photographs still to come, that Muybrige got out of this mess. He admitted to the murder, and had he been found guilty, he would have faced hanging. At the time, people who murdered usually pleaded insanity if the evidence was against them. As for Muybrige's lawyers, instead of just pleading insanity, they also pushed what was known as the unwritten law. It was not a law, but rather an assumed right, the right to shoot your spouse's lover. It was similar to shooting an invader in your house. The right did not set well with many people, but throughout the South and the West, the unwritten law was well known. After a few days of testimony, the judge personally concluded that Muybrige was guilty, but the jury declared him not guilty due to his assumed right as a husband. Muybrige had stated that fact to Larkins when he threatened him. Many articles appeared across the country with headlines similar to "The Death of a Seducer," and some newspapers stood by the man's right to kill another if the other was stealing his wife. The right was casually referred to as Muybrige's law, and there was an effort to eliminate that assumed right. After the trial and declaration of not guilty, a large crowd formed outside the courthouse and cheered when Muybrige stepped outside as a free man. The real tragedy is what happened to Flora. Was she really a gold digger? Who knows? She had applied for divorce shortly before the trial, and Muybrige labeled her an unfit mother. The press slid into her and destroyed her reputation. In one article, she was referred to as a silly, vain little beauty, and the comment was followed by another. How quickly beauty fades, when there is naught else but beauty to brighten. Victorian values were hard on her. The opinion was that any woman foolish enough to believe the promises of a seducer deserved her fate, no matter how cruel it was. Flora was dead 6 months after the trial. She apparently got sick and was paralyzed for 2 weeks before she passed away. The press reveled in her broken spirit and in God's punishment. Even in death, she was lambasted and shamed. She died destitute and friendless. Florado became Muybrige's ward. Unfortunately, he assumed the boy to be Harry's child and shoved him into an orphanage, although Muybrige did provide for his care. Florado lived into his 70s, and he always recognized Eadweard Muybrige as his father. After the trial, Muybrige took off on the previously mentioned Central American tour that stopped in ports that were serviced by the Central Pacific Railroad or one of its subsidiary companies. Some people interpret that tour as an escape from the publicity of the murder trial. Since there's not much of a record of correspondence between Muybrige and Stanford, much of what is said about the relationship is speculation. To some of Stanford's men, it was odd that the ex-governor had become so close to such an eccentric man who was also known as a murderer. None of this relationship is really understood, which is sad, as it really determines who was responsible for what during their days at Palo Alto. All that's known is that by the later 1870s, both men were fired up about taking photographs of horses running. Now we get to the photography project. It seems to be around the fall of 1876 that Stanford came across the writings of Etienne Jules Murray. I had mentioned in the third podcast that Murray had published his work in a series of scientific journals through the late 1860s and into the early 1870s. In 1873, he compiled them into a book that was published in France. A British version of the book came out a year later. It would be another 5 years before an American version of the book came out. Books published in England appeared in America quite often, but only if they could be successfully marketed. There probably was little profit to be expected from a science book that discussed such an obscure corner of physiology. It's possible someone who knew Stanford's interests either pointed him to the book or sent him a copy. Historian Edward Ball thinks that Stanford may have stumbled across a copy of the December 1874 issue of Popular Science, which ran a full article about Murray's recent work. Either way, Stanford was fascinated by Murray's discoveries of animal movement, especially the parts about the horse. Undoubtedly, Murray's work inspired the idea to determine how a horse ran. It's even possible that Stanford had discussions with his friends about what he read. It's also possible that he and someone else got into a heated discussion about the running pattern of horses' feet. It could even be that they argued over whether all 4 feet were off the ground at one time or not. But remember, this is all speculation. There is no proof of a bet or even of a major discussion on the subject. All that's really known is that Stanford and Muybrdige discussed Murray's work, and they both said so. Muybrdige returned to California in the fall of 1875. While it does seem that he spent most of the next year lying low, he did spend time processing the photos of his Central American trip, as well as showing them to Stanford and even exhibiting them at the San Francisco Art Association. A year later, when Stanford discovered the work of Etienne Jules Murray, he and Muybrdige started discussing their next project, and before the end of 1876, Muybrdige had purchased a number of lenses courtesy of Stanford, suggesting that they were preparing for the project. From late 1876 to the time they seriously took their horse pictures at Palo Alto, a year and a half would elapse. That seems like a really long time to prepare for a photo shoot, even if it was experimental. While it seems that they had to figure out a number of problems, it's also been mentioned that in 1877, Stanford had become one of the targets of a massive protest movement known as the Great Strike. Unemployment had taken hold, and many people believed that the creators of this vast pool of unemployed Americans came from the reckless financial behavior of America's railroad financiers. As a railroad tycoon, Stanford conveniently fit the bill. The strike started up after the Stanfords moved into their new mansion in mid-1876. Around the same time, they bought Mayfield Grange and some of the surrounding properties. It would take some time for the horse farm to be built, and before it was ready, Muybrdige would take the first photos of his latest horse sessions at Union Park Track in Sacramento. It was there that he started to test his bank of 12 cameras. He may even have used some form of the bedsheet idea that they had previously tried out. At some point during these preliminary photo tests, Muybrdige became frustrated with the crowds. This was due to the onlookers gaping at what he was doing and asking him questions. And who knows, maybe a few of them were asking personal questions about the murder and the trial. Muybrdige decided to stop working at the park and let the ex-governor know that he'd prefer to work at Palo Alto. It would be a while before Muybrdige started up again. Muybrdige continued with other photo projects. Probably the most well-known was a series he shot in San Francisco from up on Nob Hill. Mark Hopkins, one of Stanford's fellow co-owners of the railroad, was building his mansion next to the Stanfords. Still unfinished, its tower was nearing completion, so Muybrdige asked permission to climb to the top and take a series of photographs of a San Francisco panorama. Once things started up in 1877, they still had issues to tackle. One thing that needed to be considered was lighting. At Union Park, the idea of spreading bed sheets across the track was a convenient last-minute fix for the lighting issue. This time with a stand built along one side of the track and a large wall opposing it on the other side, it was just easier to paint everything white. To make things even brighter, the opposing wall was tipped just enough to reflect additional sunlight. Muybrdige also knew he would need his cameras to react fast. A triggering system had to be devised to release the shutters in sequence. Stanford's mechanic designed the system, but the San Francisco Telegraph Supply Company built it. At first, the concept involved using threads to trigger the camera mechanisms, but as the horses proved to be too skittish to run through strings, the engineer built an electrical system that was triggered by one of the wheels of the sulky. In the spring of 1878, Muybrdige was ready to go. Several tests were run to establish the reliability and quality of the setup. On a day in June, a few reporters arrived and watched as the trotter Abe Edgington passed by the row of cameras, and a series of images were quickly taken. The cameras had been placed in a row, 21 inches apart, and the noise of the shutters closing was described as a continuous roll. When the accident photo had been released to the press back in 1873, it was seen as a remarkable record of a horse's gait in one position. Since then, there had been quite a few horsemen debating the issue of the footing of a horse. Now Muybrdige had the entire sequence filmed, and while it would also provide proof to doubters concerning the timing of a horse's feet, it was also apparent to some that this sequence could be cut up into individual images and placed inside a zoetrope. Suddenly, photographic images could be placed into a moving image toy, and the reality of a running horse was not only captured in 12 images, it could also be seen moving. Probably the most important source for that idea was the issue of Scientific American that ran an article on Muybrige's images not long after the first tests were run. One of the editors suggested the idea, and others followed. Muybrdige quickly assembled his photos onto a large card. The 12 images were shown in sequence, the first 4 in the top row, the last 4 in the bottom row, and the middle 4 appearing appropriately in the middle row. The entire sequence of Abe Edgington's gait could now be purchased on a large card. A few other horses of Stanford's were also photographed and arranged on a card in such a fashion. Within a month, Muybrdige had another show at the San Francisco's Art Association, featuring both his serial cards and the panoramic series of San Francisco photos he had shot from Mark Hopkins' tower. But Muybrdige would not be done photographing horses for quite some time. Through the rest of the year and most of the next one, he would continue to photograph Stanford's horses. Some of them were trotters, and others were regular runners. 12 more cameras were added to catch more detail of the gaits, especially for the runners. Other animals were also included. At the same time, Muybrdige continued to entertain the Art Association with his images. This included animating them in a self-made zoopraxiscope. He would also take his presentations on the road. But that's for a later episode. Thanks for listening.